So today we're continuing obviously about frames, and let's see what we got here for the slides. I put my finger on something I wrote here. So with this overall topic, there's a lot that I know that's right? But I also, a big thing is I know something that we very commonly do in our thinking, or really a number of things, but there's kind of a particularly wrong way to have a mental model of the world. There's some like critical errors that people make that I'm aware of, and it's a big part of what I'm sharing with you in this series. And by not making them, you will be much, much better off. We, including, I'd rather teach something like in a vacuum. I'd rather, of course, just show you here's what's correct, right? Here's what this is. Here's what to do. Learning what not to do is not quite as sexy or exciting or easy to explain, how important it is. But still, I don't think it'll be too hard to see value and communicate, in these webinars. But still, it makes it more challenging. Anyway, so that's just a little bit of something. What we're trying to do overall is trying to transfer a certain overall mental model I have to you that integrates the idea of mental frames and frameworks in many ways. Like it's kind of just pervasive through my model of the world and of the mind and theory of mind, and it's extremely useful. And also at the same time, when I see people going about thinking, planning, which they're doing all the time, whether or not they've identified as such, right? Or at least attempting to think and plan and make decisions. People don't really do a lot of thinking about their process and their model for doing that, but they're using it all the time. So they're kind of implying that they're doing a great job since they're not working on it. They kind of have closure about their process, right? And their theory of mind, right? That theory of mind, for example, is not a term that people use very often. I was reading, I think it was in Subliminal, actually, that book that I mentioned last time, and I've mentioned in the past. But I think it was in that book. It might have been a different one, but that one thing that scientists these days, cognitive scientists, know strongly separates humans from animals is that humans have a theory of mind, and it is utterly important. It's used in like everything we do, but people don't really reflect on the fact that they have a theory of mind. It's like being a fish in water, where people just take it for granted. But by default, our theory of mind, of our own mind, of other people's minds, of how our minds interact with the world and with getting what we want and us being happy and all that, is deeply flawed, actually, in identifiable ways. And if we, probably all, but at least some of those big flaws are known to me since identifying them. And as I've identified more and kind of fixed things more over time, my effectiveness has gone up tremendously. And in another way of putting it, which I want to start to introduce in this webinar, my own sort of business in a box, like my sort of business technique, which is separate, and it's in addition to the way that I kind of have a framework for business, which is where my original way of putting it was like it consists of product, traffic, and conversion. More recently, I reframed that a bit into where you need to have a product that fits like a potential audience that will potentially buy it. That's one thing. Or like fulfillment, you have to be able to fulfill that, and then you need to be able to bring people to a decision with like sales and conversion, and then you need to have relationships, right? Which is like your traffic, or one aspect of it, like your actual traffic. That kind of splits the idea of potential traffic. That kind of splits that way of thinking about it. Splits potential traffic and actual traffic up, where you think about your potential traffic and your potential sales together with your product that you're bringing to market, creating and bringing to market. And then in terms of getting actual traffic and leads, then you need to build and maintain relationships and such. Anyhow, that's a framework for business that's very important for me, and I use it consistently. It's kind of an overall way of looking at it. But when I talk about a business in a box using frames, that's kind of a separate idea. Both are useful, the framework idea, but the business in a box idea is I kind of made my own business kind of system, or really, again, like a kind of a business in a box for myself, where my product or service that I, in a sense, brought to market was being able to think and plan and make decisions, and which involves paying attention to frames in the way that I'm sharing with you. This is not something that people have hardly any idea of. So that kind of gave me a unique product in a sense, and then I'm kind of giving you this option as well, just like if you learn SEO from us and you're one of the very few people that understands then how to do search engine optimization well on Amazon or Google or YouTube, then you kind of have a unique thing you can offer that's valuable. What I was able to do was something along those lines, where I kind of invented my own product rather than having to go out and try to figure out a unique object or other kind of service or whatever. Then I figured this stuff out, and by applying it, I was able to create the overall framework for a business where other people were then able, that I work with, were able to then fit into it in a nice way, where they didn't really need to understand what I knew about frames at the time. They just kind of needed to do what they did well and what they enjoyed doing, which, as part of my understanding of frames, I paid attention to and identified myself. And it all worked really well. So it's like my business in a box involved using this whole frames idea, essentially, and making that my product, using it to then bring a kind of a product to market, like with teaching, like the coaching with SEO or with how to make money online. But my product was more immediate. It was kind of one step removed from that, right? My product was like what I was doing with my partners or the business that I was creating, but kind of what I was doing for the people I was working with. And by doing that, kind of provided, it was almost like I had a consulting business where I was providing that service to a few talented partners, and then as a whole was able to guide that into a business, bringing something to the market as a whole, where we get paid by customers and such. To the extent that I'm able to transfer that to you, that I'm working on in this series, and to the extent that it kind of resonates with you and you like it, then you can very potentially do the same type of thing, where and I started out making like my own kind of business, originally with teaching accelerated learning and such for years. But then through Mike, I was able to get a kind of come on and help and be given kind of a monthly amount of money to work on a product launch in the internet marketing space over 10 years ago now, I suppose it was. But with my knowledge of also this kind of idea of frames and such, I was able to really get a sense of what was going on, both kind of details and the overall sense of it. So I came out of that experience really having a good sense of how it all worked, in a way that the other people involved with it didn't have the same sense. They were more wrapped up in their aspect of things, which also it's natural to kind of overvalue, right? It's a common thing for both employees and entrepreneurs to kind of overvalue and kind of focus on what you're bringing to the table. And so other people were more focused on their specific thing that they were doing and to some degree taking credit for it, right, as well, and posturing and all that. But I was really curious and looking at how things fit together, and just had an overall way that I looked at the whole thing, where I really kind of broke it down and understood it quite well. So that then I was able to do it basically better once I was in charge, so to speak, and do make OMG machines, but based on a lot of what I learned there. So I had some specialized knowledge I picked up, but I picked up that specialized knowledge about product launches and how to structure an information business and an online information business product launch and all that stuff. as kind of a subset of my overall understanding of frames and learning and so forth, creativity, creative problem solving, all that. So a little bit like with learning SEO, there's going to be a certain amount perhaps of complexity, or it's not really complex, this topic. It's more something that, to be cliche, is kind of out of the box, or that you don't have, that you may not have much of a framework for, where you wanted or had a lot of the questions that I'm addressing and pointing out to you and then addressing on this series. You might not have had them coming in. Perhaps you did if you've been following along with me, to some degree or to a greater degree. But we're addressing questions here that typically people aren't really asking. There are more, people tend to assume that they already have this stuff figured out when they most certainly don't, right? Just like, people tell even young children, right, think about it, right? Or at some point in your life, relatively early, people say, think for yourself. But if you say that to someone, what are you implying? You're implying that if they're not an idiot, they already have the framework to do that, right? That they're already able to think for themselves. So you're sort of creating a kind of a hidden sense of ridicule to the idea of figuring out how to think, because we're being told things that imply we should already know how to do that. That good, smart people that deserve approval and respect and so forth already know how to think, already know how to learn as well, right? So we're constantly getting all these implications and messages that we already should have this stuff figured out. And so people don't address these questions. Even things like theory of mind, it's not something that people tend to be particularly obsessed with, even though it has just such a tremendously massive impact upon our lives. And the flaws in it are, if people really worked at it, they're not that hard to spot, at least some of them. And people would stop making just major thinking errors constantly. Okay. So let's get to a kind of deep-seated error, and then get a sense of a good starting sense of the correct way to look at it. And there's maybe a couple of related ideas too. So as I start to address things, it might open up other questions that are related and so forth. And we'll see how far we can get. Let me just take a quick look at the discussion thread here. Make sure everything's good. Wish I could reframe AT&T Internet Company. Hey Mike, how you doing? Is the audio choppy? Okay, for me. Hopefully it's your crappy DSL. We doing okay with the audio and everything? Hey Megan, how you doing? Great. That concept of telling a kiddo to think about it has been one of the big exercises that helped me break out of the frame that I've already got it figured out. Good, yeah, because I pointed that out in the past, right? It really helped me to go back and sort out thinking in scenarios versus associations. Good. Good, and I'll give you some more thought on that in this webinar, I think. Good, the audio is solid, great. Okay. So I'm about to point out something here that is ultimately pretty major, all right? There's a way, what I want us to do, I started to talk last time about like objects as representations, or at least representations as representations, where we realize when something that we're thinking about or that we think of as even an object in real life or whatever is really a representation of something, all right? And I don't even want to say it's a representation of that object, because there's this kind of tangled up thing in our thinking where, because we think in terms of representations while at the same time really typically not thinking of representations as representations. Which means that untangling it may take a little bit of doing, because every time you go to think about, even when we ask the question, what is it? It's like it rolls off our tongue so fast. Well, what is this, David? What's our reason? right? What do you mean by object? Could you define what you mean by object? Could you define what you mean by representation? Even the assumption that we can even do that together so easily is wrong. In order to there's a couple things going on. A representation is one thing. Saying what something is, in order to do that, it's necessary to have a greater frame and background that we can, like if I were to tell you what a Tetris like cut up piece was, that, you know, Tetris, like little shaped pieces are falling down, and I guess you have to spin them around or something. I played just not much in my life, but I pick it because it's one of the well-known games. If you're explaining what a Tetris puzzle piece is, or a piece in a game, or a piece in a Monopoly game, or an aspect of a Monopoly game, then you're going to need to do one of two things. You can make an analogy. You can say, well, this, buying a property in Monopoly is like such and such, whatever. Or a Tetris piece is like, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but you know what I mean. You can say it's like such and such in a game that they know, or heck, if they play golf, maybe you can say, it's like that something or other. You try to come up with some parallel. So that would be an analogy, which is related to a representation, right? It isn't the exact same thing of what it is, but it gives someone some sense within a different framework, right? If you were to come up with, I'm thinking of a little bit of this on the fly, so I can't think of a good analogy between a piece in Tetris that you're trying to fit as it floats down and something in golf. But if someone did say, this is like that in golf, then there would be an understanding that the person didn't have a framework to directly be told what something was within Tetris, and so we needed to come up with an analogy and something else. And then someone might say, oh, got it. And, in practice, that might be mostly to get the person to shut up about Tetris. Because if they say they don't got it, then the person's going to keep talking, right? Or else they might, feel like, okay, I have a sense of it. So you can give an analogy to something in a different framework where there's going to be some amount of overlap. And then if the overlap works, if the person goes to use it or whatever, then great. And if the overlap doesn't work out when it's supposed to, then you're going to have an issue. Or else you need to explain the greater framework. You need to explain, like, about Tetris, right? Or if I was telling you, if someone asked who Skye was, S-K-Y-E, which is a pup in Paw Patrol, which I know that because I have a 5-year-old son, right? If someone never seen Paw Patrol, then I either need to explain Paw Patrol and to explain who Skye was, or Ryder, they're kind of a boy who's their leader, or I could relate it. I could say, she's like one of the Autobots, right, or something like that. If they watch Transformers, I could say Ryder is a little bit like Optimus Prime and the Autobots, but they're pups and they're, doing small tasks around the neighborhood. So it's one or the other. Either I need to go into do a pretty good job explaining the whole kind of framework of Paw Patrol in order to explain who Skye is, in one way, or in a different way, and it's not the same way, but another way I could make a kind of analogy, right? By describing that, though, it points out something that's kind of assumed away when people ask, well, what is it? Like, what is an object? Well, my background worldview for how the world works is different than the kind of common one, although I'm also aware of the common one. I'm aware of how we all generally view the world, right? I've done the same thing. But it's a more involved question than it can seem. If someone says, well, what is a reason or what is an object, I either then explain my entire framework for the world, which I'm working on, right? But it takes that to do it. Or else I try to make some kind of analogy, but the analogy is going to be inherently flawed, like any analogy, right? It overlaps where it does, and it doesn't overlap where it doesn't, right? So as soon as someone starts trying to use an analogy too much or too pervasively, then it kind of breaks down, right? At some point, it doesn't overlap with what I really mean. and literally everything I'm saying now is part of transferring my overall model of frames and everything to you, right? The very idea that to understand what something is, pointing out that you can only do that if the you and the person you're speaking to both have quite a clear and shared idea of the framework that you're describing what it is inside of that framework. So what it is relative to how it fits into a framework. Is there such thing as what something is objectively? Well, there is, in the sense of, to the extent that there's a greatest frame, kind of a foundational overall truth in the world that can set a frame for what's really going on. And to the extent that you can start there with someone, or you and someone else both, or you just by yourself, have a clear idea of that, then you can understand what something is in a more objective sense, right? It's relative to a correct foundational frame, but then the word relative kind of disappears, right? If it's a kind of a foundational, necessarily true backdrop for the world no matter what, then it doesn't really matter anymore whether something inside of it is what it is, objectively or relatively. All right. One of the things I want to get us to here, so on the top of the slide I say objects with qualities, and I wrote a question mark. There is a truth, but it's kind of a truth by analogy. Like it's to say that objects have qualities is kind of like if I say that Sky is like one of the Autobots if Paw Patrol was the Autobots. It was Transformers. Meaning that you can usefully use the idea that an object like you, if you think of yourself as an object that has intelligence or that is smart, right? If you've had an occasion to say, oh, I'm really smart. Or if you say, I am angry, right? So that's like I as an object, potentially, right? That's a typical meaning of that, is treating yourself or your mind like an object. Or people say, I want to control my mind. I want to be more motivated, right? So it's like they're speaking of themselves as an object, and they want that object to have the quality of being motivated. Or is the Bible true? They're speaking of the Bible as an object, and they're asking if it has the quality of being true, right? Or a person is nice, or oh no, that person isn't bad, they're nice, right? Or that guy's a jerk. That's why he didn't buy from me, or that's why they're refunding, or that's why they're doing this, that, or the other thing, is because they're lazy or they're a jerk, right? So again, it's object with a quality. That is a simplistic view of the world. It's kind of a surface view of the world that it's a representation that will sometimes be useful, but plenty of times it won't be. And it's a very limited way of looking at things, and it leads to premature closure, right? If you were to take someone who's angry or hurt and attempt to show them how not to be by reframing the issue that's going on for them, then to the extent that they view themselves as an object that is angry, they have the quality anger, then they get themselves in this closed frame, right, of mind, where if they viewed anger as the result of various frames interacting, like saying you're angry would be like if I asked someone to pass me the salt, right, at the dinner table, and they say, well, the salt is on my side. And I was like, yeah, it's on your side, so could you pass it to me? And they're like, no, well, they look at me like I was being ridiculous and said, no, it's on my side. How could I pass it to you, right? That would be ridiculous, because we don't look at the salt shaker as having the quality. We might say it has, think of it like whatever, say it has the position where it's over there, but it's not like a quality that that we feel like has some resistance to being changed, right? it doesn't close ourselves, doesn't make ourselves feel like we can't pass it because it's over there on the table, right? But people do that constantly with all sorts of qualities, intelligence being one. Intelligence is really just your intelligence regarding a specific topic or a general topic like music, or a specific topic like a particular, being able to play a particular musical piece or whatever, pick any other topic, where you can be kind of generally good at technology or specifically good at a particular technology. If in the situation at hand, people are kind of immersed in where your framework is applicable, they might be like, wow, you're really smart, right? But really, intelligence is just something that you kind of observe on the surface. The thing about the qualities is they're treated by people, and this is a critical part of your overall worldview that you would have generally absorbed from the whole world, right? Just like all of us. But it's critically wrong. Qualities don't cause things. So people talk constantly about how, oh, well, he could do that because he's smart, or they did that because they're a jerk, or I did this because I was angry, right? Or because I was excited, so I did this, right? Whatever. That event was that food was tasty, so I enjoyed eating it, right? Or that event was boring, so I was bored, right? Whatever. Again, as a representation that usefully overlaps with things once in a while, sure, that's correct, right? Having a sense that someone, functionally can act like a jerk, right? Or whatever you would think about if you just felt like this guy is a jerk, all right? Then that might overlap usefully with reality at times. It might correctly predict how a person would react. I don't deny that. But like with someone that wouldn't pass the salt because they felt like the salt had a position that was causing it to stay over there, right? And it just was the way things were. And of course they can't change that, right? It's just inherent within the salt that it's over there on the table rather than here. People in real life, in practice, act that way. That's obviously ridiculous with the salt shaker, and attribute causes to things that further closes them off and blinds them from looking at the frames that result in what we call a symptom, right? That of anger. But it's just a symptom, just like the salt being positioned where it is. And if we do something to change the position of the salt, then it's going to be positioned somewhere else, right? The position doesn't cause it not to be moved over, to where I am, right? And someone might still be thinking, well, but David, doesn't anger cause people to do things? It's a little bit more like there's an underlying cause that both manifests itself looking like anger that we can identify and would lead to various actions and so forth. So it's more correct and useful, I would say, to think of it. We're always kind of talking to ourselves, to each other with representations. So there's a way that everything I say will at some level in communicating and in picturing it for myself will be a representation. What we're trying to do is get the representation to be at least more useful and accurate. And when you understand something as a representation, you're more able to do that. So even as I talk about frames, I'm still talking, we're still creating a representation of frames. I'm not exactly telling you what a frame is so much as giving you a better representation of the whole situation that we can continue to hone and make better. But anyhow, if we think of it like there's a number of frames or ingredients, you can think of them even like waves or vectors or factors that result in someone being angry. And it's not a bunch of objects either. It's not like, well, this event happened that that had badness to it and that caused the person to be angry, right? That's just making the same mistake all over again. I've talked about this before briefly, but like the ingredients that go into anger involve frames more like this, where there's a certain way that people frame a goal as like it's an object that's desirable that will do stuff for them that they want. And it could be an event, could be a certain state, like a website's ranking, or a person says yes, to something. But it's framed as a goal, and which is kind of turned into like an object, right? Like a mental object. When I say object, I mean that in kind of a general sense. Where an event, in the way that I'm talking about it, can be like an object, or someone saying yes can be like an object with a quality. In the way that I'm talking right now. So we have this goal, right? And then we feel this sense of we want to make progress toward a goal, right? And then we have another separate type of frame, which has to do with naturalness or not, where there's certain resources and effort and stuff we have to do and spend, or distance we have to travel, or actions we have to take that are categorized as natural in our mind, regardless whether they are or not in reality. They're represented that way. It's a category in our mind that's treated with, it's a very important difference or frame in our mind, is naturalness, knowing to have, like having that distinction that you and other people think that way and react massively different depending on whether a particular event or object or happening or thing that whatever that happens is viewed as natural or not. So anything that's categorized as natural by someone's mind, they basically will feel motivated to do if they want the goal in the first place. The goal itself feels important. Then all the natural things that go with it, the resource they have to spend, right? If it feels natural to spend 3 meetings and a half an hour each with some preparation to get a client, then that's all happily and done with motivation, essentially. If the person wants the goal, in the first place. However, when there's something that is generally unexpected, but either expected, whether something's expected or not is a little bit tangential or different. But if something basically unnatural, sometimes you can expect something and you're hoping it won't happen, and it still pisses you off even if you expect it, right? You can have, or there can be something that you're like, damn it, they're going to say this again. I know it. I hate when they say that, right? So you kind of expect it, but there still feels something unnatural about it, like it should be different, right? Some of the language we use when something's categorized as unnatural, and the way that I mean it is like, like it should be otherwise, right? So when something that's categorized as unnatural happens that is categorized, is perceived and represented as impeding, right, or making it more difficult, more resources, setback, whatever, towards a goal that you want, then the mind goes and it asks another question, in essence. And everything I'm describing now is I'm giving you examples of frames. So people say, what do you mean by frames? I'm showing you, as opposed to like this statement that the person said made me angry, right? That's like an object with qualities of annoyance, right, that made you angry, that gave you the quality of anger. Instead, I'm expressing this in terms of a recipe of frames, right? And it's probably making sense to you as I explain it, where, again, the goal is represented in a certain way. Then there's the category of naturalness, which is huge. When there's something unnatural, that's also a setback, right? There's like, if there's something, I guess, unnatural, but that's moves you forward, then you kind of react with some sort of happy, like version of happiness, right? But if it's perceived as a setback, then the next question is it something where it's like a person did this intentionally or by a sort of kind of intentional type of neglect, or a neglect that they shouldn't have done, like that if they really had they weren't lazy or had the right intentions and so forth, they wouldn't neglect it. So is it like a person who should have done something differently? then if so, then that'll lead to a sense of anger. Including, you can actually be angry at like a computer if your mind, right, this is done subconsciously with your mind can feel like a machine or a computer or even a tree at times or whatever, theoretically is like kind of like a person. Often it doesn't, but sometimes it can. Probably not a tree actually, but you never know. But a computer for sure, a car, right? People can get like angry at a car, like, why are you doing this to me, right? When you start kind of anthropomorphizing it. So if it seems like it's a person who should have done something differently, then the person will feel anger. If it feels like it's not a person, there's no real person involved, then it can be more like frustration, right? Like a tree fell in your path, you know, when you're driving and it backed up traffic, you might feel frustrated. So it's a sequence of frames now, as I'm describing it, that leads to the emotion, and you can undo and dissolve the emotion, which leads me to another point in a second. But you can dissolve it by removing one of the ingredients, all of which are necessary to get to anger or whatever else. Regarding intelligence, the useful thing about representing it properly with frameworks is that you can duplicate and also identify in advance more accurately, and also unblock when helpful, and so forth. You can duplicate intelligence for yourself. You can identify reliable functional intelligence in other people regarding various topics. It all has to do with frameworks that they have already in their minds, right? Intelligence is basically non-existent as a cause. It's just a kind of a figment of our imagination almost, based on the underlying reality of a person having a mental framework for a particular thing or not. Including the exact same person will seem to people to be intelligent or not, depending on the, you know, what the overall circumstances are making which framework is relevant, right? If you're stuck in the woods and you don't know survival skills, you're, you know, an accountant, and you're a brilliant accountant, people, you know, can easily think that you're stupid, right? Then something comes up where they need your accounting skills, and all of a sudden they think you're smart, right? When we represent things properly, it can be very helpful in business for me to see things in terms of frameworks, including people tend to enjoy using their frameworks that they have productively, right? On the surface, it looks like skills, but again, the underlying thing is they have a framework for things, including they might have skills in a number of places. They might have a framework, excuse me, in a number of places regarding a topic and just lack it in a few other places. And then you understand more directly what's going on with that person. Sometimes you can help them deal with that and get the framework, or you can call on someone else, or you can be more patient with them, and, you know, and so forth, by having a sense of what's really going on. Also, if, you know, you praise a kid for being smart, then you can accidentally imply that they have a meta framework for things they don't, or a specific framework for things they don't. When someone seems generally smart, it's because they have a meta framework for a bunch of things that are related, you know, or whatever. The stuff that I tend to talk about in my webinars is a meta framework that will make you functionally significantly smarter in basically everything in life, but you'll still be functionally an idiot regarding very specific things you don't have a framework for until you learn them, right? When you know that all you have to do is get the framework, then that typically removes blocks and speeds you up greatly, because you just know, I just go get it, right? You don't. Instead, people say like, well, no, I'm no good. I'm an object with the quality of being no good at that particular aspect of life. Right? Again, premature closure, frame blindness, bias, silly, right? When you realize it just has to do with frameworks, and then understanding that the meta frame of understanding frameworks and how to acquire them in your mind and so forth, which touches on accelerated learning, right? Or learning, right? Really, accelerated learning is a nonsense concept, right? When I talk about accelerated learning, what are we talking about? Learning, right? The better you understand learning or have a framework for how learning actually works, then the more effectively and efficiently, quickly, right, you'll do it, and do it properly according to the, like, and also learn what you're, what's relevant for what you actually have to do, not just be able to, you know, repeat stuff that won't actually be helpful for the task that you need to do. And you won't be trying to prove something, right? Normally, and there's a whole bunch of blocks, you know, that go along with all kinds of stuff in life, but learning, right? When a big block with learning is people are trying to prove that they already have the framework before they have it, right? Or that they already have the meta framework or whatever the heck. So accelerated learning is just a nonsense concept for just understanding learning, right? Or a silly way to express the idea of understanding learning and how it works. And you're well along your way. Just be able to get this framework idea, and then you're ahead of virtually everyone when it comes to understanding learning. Other people might look like they learn faster than you in certain places in life because they have a framework for learning that thing, or it just feels important to them, which is a big part of the framework for learning. A lot of learning comes down to your mind concluding or encoding or however you want to represent it, that topic matters and that the specific details that you're going to want to learn matter relative to just getting the gist of it, right? If you want to remember details, then the specific details that you're trying to learn need to feel important as compared to just generally remembering, oh, it was about approximately like this or something like that, right? If you want to remember the exact words of a paragraph in a book, then you would need to get your mind to decide that the exact words were important. You should need to perform actions and give yourself in frames and an environment that implied that the exact words were important. Right. Once you know that's the case, then it's fairly easy to come up with how to do that. Okay, let me take a look at the discussion thread here. Unusual, where I remember to look at it partway through here. Hey, Anorexia, how you doing? Better late than never. Happy to be excited. Glad you're here. Julie said, creative problem solving. Feels like that's 80% of my life at the moment. I'd really like to reduce that percentage. Oh, yeah, I know. You know, it's interesting because so much of my money-making career was that where I would wake up in the morning and I would feel like now you might have more than just money getting. You might have family stuff or whatever. But with money getting, it was like I would wake up in the morning and feel like I didn't really know what I needed to know in order to do what I needed to do to, before I went to sleep that night, right? Like something as simple even as writing a sales letter or getting more leads or installing a particular membership software or whatever. Or getting someone to get over some problem, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of it, but then it, resulted in a lot of money at least. So I thought that maybe I would get to a point where it was mostly I had the framework and I was just doing it, and that was kind of my dream. But by the time I got there, I pretty much had enough money. So never really got to the point where, you're always kind of breaking the next bottleneck, right, until you're done. So you more have to feel comfortable with kind of that role in life, I think, as far as I can tell. But I'm a little bit guessing or whatever. But just saying, in case my experience helps you at all. Let's see here. Yay, let's go. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Fletch said, maybe abstract, but a scenario I consider when teaching something. When you're talking about these distinctions of events, objects, happenings regarding goals, as you're talking and thinking and describing things, are you operating and then talking for your frame of understanding more than thinking backward from people who you are talking to on these webinars who don't have or understand the frame? I don't know. Why I get caught up is kind of dealing with both, right? Where I'm better off understanding this stuff better myself, but then I also need to kind of describe it to people that don't yet have it. Somehow I don't fully follow. Anyway, the answer I come to, or I kind of think about something similar, I think, and then I think I have to kind of do both, right? And then I kind of get partially tangled up, and then partially I get to the point where it's the time for the webinar. Then I do my best. Lucas says, what if someone has no mental framework but an intuitive one? They can intuitively make the right decision. Okay, so you're thinking that they have no framework that that they can kind of consciously access, in essence, is the way I would put it. then they still have a framework in their mind. When I say they have a framework, I'm talking about their mind has a framework, including and for me, the mind is non-conscious, right? It's like something that we have, and so I realize it gets confusing. But the trouble is, our language is kind of inherently confusing. It's kind of hard to talk without jumbling together you and your mind and so forth at times. I could try to pay attention to it, but then I'd be kind of distracted by doing that. And then, so yeah, one way or the other, if someone's making the right decisions or feeling the right decisions, even my example of like a running back in football, if they kind of feel the right way to go, or if someone's a sword fighter or a fencer and they kind of feel the right thing to do, and they have to do it by feel because by the time they thought about it and reflected on it, it'd be too late, right? Even writing copy, right, or doing a sales pitch or a presentation, or even me doing this webinar, right? I mean, I have to kind of do it by feel. I obviously didn't write out a script, and I'm not reading it right now, right? And I don't even, sometimes a particular structure comes to mind for this webinar. There wasn't a particular much of a structure. I have a number of slides, but I don't, and I have some structure and a few illustrations I want to share and stuff like that, but nothing like that's particularly extra helpful. Sometimes I, again, I kind of have a particularly helpful structure. Mainly helpful for myself. Probably isn't even necessarily that important for other people. So anyway, that enabled me to kind of explain that by you asking that. One way or the other, if you're making the right decisions regarding something, the framework is there in your mind for doing it. In the way I mean framework. Basically, that's kind of my definition, like what I'm saying. Bryce says, so I have this issue where if someone snaps back at me or gives me a negative or snide remark, I almost take it as though they're attacking me. In reality, that false sense of being a victim only leads into trouble. Yeah. And this is another way in which the more you have an overall backdrop of a worldview, we'll all fall prey to this at times, right? Especially if we're kind of distracted or whatever, immersed in something else. But when you have an overall view that even your idea of you can, like, remember, to other people, they can only have a representation of you. Even you yourself have a representation of you. Your mind even has a representation of you and itself and so forth. So think one thing you can have a little bit more as integrated in your sense of how the world works is that someone can kind of only attack the representation of you. And their representation of you and then their response to your representation of you, right, there's a whole bunch of factors, right, that are beyond what you can, be aware of. They could have had a bad day. They could feel like the world is scarce, and if you have a bunch of stuff for an attractive woman, then they have less. So there's a whole number of possibilities. They could be on their way to becoming a tremendously wonderful person and reflecting on things, but are not there yet, right? So there's so much that goes into a person's responses and interactions with you. And again, they're really addressing themselves at their representation of you as well. So as you integrate more and more of that, it gives you more of a kind of a conceptual space between feeling like directly attacked, right? You get to where you're much more practical about things, where someone really has to kind of go after you physically to even really start to be an issue, and stuff like that, or kind of go after your property, like hacking into your bank account or something before they can even really even start to kind of be an issue or a problem. I feel like Six Sigma, after you've completed it, is all about breaking bottlenecks and industries. I think it literally is. I think that's their whole innovation, is they kind of have a system about, now that you bring that up about bottlenecks, not about Six Sigma specifically, but you see, it's easy to think in terms of bottlenecks if you see the world in terms of frames, like I'm trying to give you. Then bottlenecks are kind of an obvious part of that. when you view the world in terms of like objects with qualities that cause things, then there's like obstacles or setbacks, like people see that stuff, but that's only a small subset of what I mean by bottlenecks. And so like regardless of Six Sigma, if a machine like actually breaks down, then an owner of like a manufacturing plant or a foreman would figure out to fix it. But thinking in terms of bottlenecks in other ways is not so obvious to people with the way they normally look at things. For me, a bottleneck is more like a factor, which could be like an assumption, it could be a condition, it could be lack of awareness of something, it could be not knowing how to reach an audience. You know, if you think in terms of product, traffic, and conversion, I'll just use the simple kind of thing of that, not the more elaborate one that I got into in the end of dimensionality. So if you think in terms of product, traffic, or conversion, trying to think how to describe it in terms of the default way that people look at things. The way the mind normally works is it tries to find like I've said this before, but it tries to find what's kind of big and obvious and different or missing in the environment and blame and assign kind of blame to that, or blame or accolades, whatever, to that. So someone's trying to make money and they have a product, let's say, that they got manufactured or whatever it might be. Or they have a connection to a product, whatever. They have a product, and they're trying to make money with it. What they identify as the bottleneck by default, or they don't call it a bottleneck. So they'll be like, well, I need to make sales. Like I need, like they'll picture like you might call it like the glory hound, but I don't know if that conveys my meaning very well. But like they'll think about like what they want. They'll kind of turn that into an object. And either they'll feel like, well, I want that, and they'll just want that, and they'll want someone, and then they'll look for a source is one thing that can give them that, and that's when they'll be easily manipulated. Or they identify, they feel like, well, this is in the way of me doing that. And something that might even be just, well, this person just won't call me back. If they would just call me back, and they get fixated on they need that person to call them back, or whatever it is. But you're kind of fixated on an object with a quality that's causing something, and that's kind of the only way they can view progress. Instead, I look at it like three things have to kind of flow, have to kind of be open and working and flowing in my direction. I need to have like kind of three currents that are all, working. And any one of them is going to make the other two easier, right? So is the product working in my favor, or is it not very helpful in terms of helping me get relationships with people that might be prospects and keep their attention and get them to decide to buy. And then, is how I'm presenting myself in terms of sales and marketing. Is that where it can be kind of opened up in terms of the current being more, flowing in my favor, like that sort of way of thinking about it. And I find that to be a very effective way of looking at business, where stuff like Six Sigma then becomes kind of obvious and intuitive, and it doesn't need to be kind of taught separately once you look at it that way. You liked how I said that, Ishmael? Someone can only attack the representation of you, right? And I mean that literally. When I say that, that's not like a credo. It's not something I have to tell myself. It's so integrated into my worldview that it's correct, right? Literally. like they can't see me because I don't think I can see me, right? One of the things I'm trying to fill in here for you guys is that we have to think at the level of representations, a little bit like if you had to talk to ambassadors in order to deal with countries. The problem is when you don't think of representations as representations, kind of like if you didn't think of an ambassador as an ambassador, then that would be a problem. The problem isn't that you have to talk to the ambassador or talk to ambassadors in general, but the problem would be not understanding how they relate or that they're a representation. Imagine if you never could see an actual country. Then you couldn't know how the ambassador related to the country in the sense that it wasn't like you would know everything about the country, know everything about the ambassador, and compare the two. Right? Imagine if that wasn't the case, because that's actually how real life is we think in terms of representations of ourselves, of other people, right? Even your parents or your loved ones. When you think of them, you literally have to think of a mental representation of them that hopefully overlaps usefully with how they're going to act, who they are, things, and with decisions you want to make that'll benefit them and so forth. But it's a lot like money is really helpful because it reduces, it allows everything to operate on a playing field that can be compared, right? Everything can kind of be compared, let's say, to dollars. Right, that's almost literally true in the sense of it being kind of the world's reserve currency, but it's super helpful. Right, it's not a bad thing. It's a very helpful thing. We need to and do and should even do it more purposefully. When I talk about thinking in scenarios and communicating, and we need to think in terms of not just representations, but think about the backdrop of the world that we think of as reality. It doesn't even have to be real. We just want to identify how we represent the world and kind of what our analogy is, right? For the world. We can improve on it and hone it as well, but by identifying it, that helps you do that. But just like being aware of something's value in dollars is really critical in a lot of cases. It's not even just a convenience. You kind of can't live without it in a number of ways. The only way you could live without it would be basically to substitute somehow for it, right? Even a theoretical barter economy, they'd still be doing some approximation of that. I'm sure that they would have to still get a sense of, well, this is worth so many chickens and that's worth so many chickens, right? Like you literally can't think without making like comparisons, right, to the same thing. Like if all you can ever do is compare apples and oranges, you can't compare, right? So you need to boil things down to a shared playing field in order to think about them. So just like everyone else, I think about the world in terms of objects, but if we were programming a computer game together, we would talk, or if we were writing a book together, right? If we were writing, let's say we were the ones writing Lord of the Rings, right? Just to pick something that a lot of people know something about, right? There's this fictitious world of Middle Earth, a little bit like medieval, fantasy with some magic involved and a big bad guy, right? And so forth, and orcs and such, men on horseback and kings and so forth. So if we were writing a book like that, then we would have a fair amount of conversations within the story. We'd be like, wait a second, Aragorn needs to do this because he already did this, and then he's going to need to do this. So he has to get this, and he has to meet with this person, right? When we're talking like that, that's important and useful, and it's within, but we understand that it's within the story. And we also at times might need to revise the entire world and say, wait a second, we need to change how we said this about this world. Something isn't internally consistent. It's not making sense. We need to change something. So we might talk about the fact that we're writing a book, right? But also talk within that world. You want to be able to do the same thing. You want to be able to think within different, frames and frameworks as appropriate, and have a sense that like an object, if we're thinking of ourselves as our body, which can be useful, and our body and mind kind of together, right? That's a useful thing, but you need to do a lot, right? If you couldn't conceptualize your body and your mind acting in the normal world as you normally do, that would be a massive problem for you, right? At the same time, you ultimately are not your body, right? But so you want to be able to represent yourself as your body and mind when it's appropriate. Just like you want to be able to think within the story of Lord of the Rings when appropriate if you're working on writing it, or again if you're watching it or reading it. And then also be able to think outside of it as appropriate. Frames do terminate. There's basic truths about reality that are objective. And when you think about frames, then part of what you realize is the incredible value of foundational frames or things that just stay true regardless. Even something as simple as 2 + 3 = 5, the meaning of that, right? You can, of course, use different words or symbols to represent 2 or 3 or 5 or equals. But the meaning of those symbols, like the meaning of 2, right? Once you have that, the meaning of plus, the meaning of 3, it'll always be 5, no matter what the universe. Okay, again, I'm not talking about the symbol can change, of course, but the concept can't. Once you put together plus, 2, and 3 and equals, you end up with 5 every time in any universe. Or in any, whatever, in anything. So questions like, does God exist, matter, become very important. When a person thinks in terms of objects that cause stuff and they can only think within their idea of the material world, then they figure, well, what does God matter, right? Because causes in their mind are all locked up in objects and events and people as objects. Even consciousness is basically something, to be hardly worried about because it doesn't fit in with their framework. They can't really put it somewhere very well. They just kind of stick it inside. They just kind of conceptualize it as happening inside someone's like skull. Like inside there is like a movie playing, right, is how a lot of people conceptualize it, which works to some degree, but it leads to massive errors in plenty of other places. And I pointed out, one of the main things I pointed out in this webinar is the problem with assigning causality to qualities of objects is that you end up in the stupid pass the salt situation where a person refuses to pass the salt because they think that the salt intrinsically is over there, or if something's on a shelf that someone can't reach. If there's a chair they could easily step on and get it. They don't realize that if they just think that somehow inherently it's too high. The object has the inherent quality of being too high, right? And then, whereas people don't make those mistakes typically, they constantly are acting as if anger is an inherent quality of the situation that needs to be felt, needs to be acted upon, is a cause of all kinds of bad decisions, is something to be avoided, but not dissolved, but you try to avoid objects that have the quality of making you angry, right? Suppose someone doesn't have the framework for how to deal with learning like Windows as opposed to the Mac. They'll assign the inherent quality of frustration to like Windows computers, right? And that's very unuseful. Right, you see what I'm saying? So people will assign these qualities to objects as if they're inherent and cause things, right? Like Windows causes me frustration. Well, it's just a set of frames, and you dissolve those frames, right? Or you reframe something, and something like that. You're just trying to find, you're constantly just trying to find the most useful set of frames to get to where you really want to get to, right? Stuff like that comes up like multiple times a day for people that try to make money. My big secret to making money, in my opinion, right? We could, give different angles on my secrets to making money, but a big one, in my opinion, was there was just a whole number of mistake types that I knew not to make, and my worldview kind of precluded making them for the most part, where it was easy not to make them. a worldview I painstakingly developed by realizing that this whole topic, right, of what's the theory of mind, how does it work, and all that stuff. How do we know it's true? And I'm in the process, and I've been in the process in other webinars and other series of communicating those types of mistakes to you and giving you the model that will lead to you not intuitively making those mistakes wrongly. But people will make mistakes like, oh, Windows frustrates me, so I don't use those, and then they'll categorize it differently, right? They'll be like, well, they suck, right? Mac users are cooler, and I'm a cool guy, right? So I'm going to use a Mac. I'm picking these at random. I'm not bagging on Macs or Mac people or anyone. Just giving you an example that pops to mind. Right, it'll be next day, or a couple hours later, it'll be like, well, I just don't like doing that, so I'm not going to do it. Next thing is, well, I'm not motivated to do such and such. Right? Again, motivation is just a set of frames. And looking for the source or the key to motivation, the key to things constantly is understanding the various vectors or frames or waves or factors that go together, just like I described the anger in terms of frames, right? Not in terms of objects, right? You understand the frames that lead to a sale, right? And it's going to vary because you're dealing with various people, but then you start to develop the frames that are common, right? I mean, people aren't that different. Right? Meta, they're not very different. Like specifically, they're different. But you look at kind of meta things and they become more and more alike. And even if people are radically different, it doesn't matter, right? There's a certain number of things to look for, and certainly people can be, if for a lot of people, they can do sales, right? But you get better and better at sales. You have an overall framework meta framework that's going to make you good at sales when you're looking for distinctions about frames. Instead, when you're looking for a source that has the quality of like working, oh, I want that script that works. I need a sales letter that works, or an ad that converts, right? Like an ad that has the inherent quality of making sales. There might be a number of frames that add together that once you put them within the current frames of the particular marketplace or a particular person, a sale is made, right? And so it might overlap with what functionally works to say like, well, this ad converts. But then it typically is going to stop. And you don't learn, and I watch people just not learning. I don't mean OMGers or not, it's just easy to see, like overall, even with gurus or whatever. Or with the non-success people will have with these conversion-based business in a boxes, where they're like, we give you the ads, we show you how to make ads that convert. What you can show, like what's going to cause you to be good at sales is the meta idea of looking for frames. Some are more universal, some are more like you have to hunt for them in a niche, right? Just the same as if you're visiting China, then there's certain universal things that might be good to know about interacting with humans, and then there's specific things that are relevant for China, right? Similarly, there's certain universal things that are going to help with conversion, right? Appearing competent and organized and clear, right? But then what clarity means might be relative to a particular audience at a particular time. What your things are implying, what specifically comes across as competent might vary, and various other stuff, right? The features that people are looking for that sizzle for them and so forth. What stands out is going to be relative to that culture, right, in that market at that time, and it could change in a few months. It could even change from your ad itself, right, from them seeing it for a while. They need something different. It's that type of understanding that makes you good at conversion. Rather than, just like with intelligence, rather than trying to prove that you're good at conversion. The minute you get stuck thinking you're already good at something, then you're going to generally get worse at it. You might still remain pretty good at it. You may not, but it's going to kind of it's going to kind of freeze you, right, where you are, and you're going to be afraid of feedback that's going to tell you otherwise and so forth. And anything that prevents you from learning the ingredients, the real vectors, not like objects so much as frames, right, that lead to results in various ways, right? Somebody liking you, someone buying your product, someone liking your product, you being motivated, right? If you want to be motivated in life or in specific instances, then instead of looking for the objects, including like environmental objects that cause you to be motivated, right? Those might help you, right? Or people treat, but what's going to help you even more is understanding what the frame is that's leading to the symptom of this object making you feel motivated. I generally don't really have problems with motivation, right? If I want something, then I go do it. I at some point I'll try to elaborate on that. That was pretty unhelpful, but at least intuitively I have a sense of something where I don't really ask the question of how do I get motivated to do such and such. I think a lot of people's issues with motivation is they're trying to do stuff, live up to other people's norms, right? It's really easy to live up to your own self-image and norms. It's kind of, you're automatically motivated to. So I think mostly what I'm trying to say is that you kind of get a sense of norms and how they affect what you want to do, right? And then when you, if you discover that your standards for whatever are in the wrong place, then part of discovering that is discovering a sense of the right place, and then that's the same thing as when your standards are in a certain place. That's the part of the frame that gives you your goals, your more specific goals, and they just arise naturally from what feels normal and what you should be at, and then you just feel motivated to do it too, and it all kind of is very simple. And so I might say, well, what if my standards are wrong? Well, then that'll give off red flags, right? You try to understand things, you seek understanding about that, and you figure out what's right for what the overall thing that you're trying to get to. And as I say, you let goals reveal themselves, and then you're going to generally be motivated as you let a goal reveal itself, because it'll all kind of be connected up. Okay, I have a question from Shema on the board for a while here. Let's take a look at it. Is a framework like doing a scenario on something you want to access, writing out what you know about it already? If you write out what you know about something, that's helpful, and that gives you words related to a framework, right? It's you can think of writing it out maybe a little bit like if you I forget what it's called, but if you take a piece of like paper or tracing paper and you put it over a leaf and you run a crayon over it, then you'll get like a representation of that leaf in crayon, right? So if you're writing out words based on what you know about something, then you'll get an effect of kind of coloring in, right, the framework in a certain way, right? It'll represent it in a different way. That'll help you reflect on it and see it. Then you go on to ask, and those items become like the walls of the framework. That's reasonable representation. That's where you would begin, yeah. And remember that the overall law of application idea is, it turns out in life, this just practically works very well, that if you focus on what you know, and then you just kind of keep building on what you know without doing a lot of speculating or worrying about what you don't know, then you're just going to pretty much keep making progress. So you'd like kind of build on what you know. For example, you might start writing out let's see, if you're trying to learn, let's just say you're trying to learn how to write a good sales letter, right? So you might say, all right, well, I know the overall structure might be problem, agitate, solve. I know that I want to share like kind of a vision and then justify it. And then you might say, well, that means I know I want testimonials. Well, I don't have any testimonials yet, but I know I want to get them, right? I don't know how to get them. Okay, well, what do I know about getting them, right? Well, if I need a product, right? Well, actually, okay, I know I can't have them until I make some sales, perhaps. Oh, wait a second, hold on. Maybe I can give my product or perform my service for a few friends, and then they can give me a genuine kind of testimonial that's reasonably honest that I can use. Okay, good, right? And so you just kind of focus on what you know, If you have a question about something you don't know, like where do I get testimonials, then again, you refocus on what you know, right? And you just kind of build. Fletch says words are important and that it makes us understand what they represent. Yeah, words do something where they allow us to express relationships that, here's kind of a simple example, is like if you imagine standing on a field and then traveling 1,000 feet, then incorporating the idea of traveling 1,000 feet into your mental image or your scenario without those words, what do? Just try to picture yourself walking 1,000 feet and like all 1,000 of it, right? Then you kind of teleport in your mind, you're using words, right, essentially, to represent how far you move. So it kind of lets you zip around scenarios and express relationships that only thinking in pictures, you can almost think of it like you run into a wall that you can only get over with words. This idea that people only think in pictures without words there's just something wrong with it, I'm quite certain. I mean, I don't even think people that think they do it that way do it that way. Of course, there's certain things you can figure out in life only using pictures, but there's a lot of things in life that you can't. So I don't know if this is practically an important issue for people, but it kind of comes up from time to time as a question about thinking using words or not. There's certain mechanical objects using gears and so forth that perhaps you could think about without words, but or whatever. There's various things you could think of without words, but a lot of things and there's just a whole bunch of relationships that you can't really add into your thinking without using words. And as a kind of shortcut for now, you can think of words as representing relationships between like parts of scenarios that you're picturing. Of course, they can represent objects, but as you understand, object is representations. An object itself is kind of inherently involves relationships between itself and the environment and so forth, and where it ends and boundaries and so forth. So that's still relationships in a scenario. Julie says, when the feeling of confidence regarding a decision is not always present, too delayed, behind. Maybe I'll be able to say something useful right now that relates to all this about decision making, like when you kind of feel indecisive. One thing that's correlated with people that make a bunch of money is that they're decisive. And I say correlated because a lot of the teaching you'll get from gurus about how to make, not how to make money, like a recipe, that's one thing. But then there's all these articles and teachings like habits of successful people in various ways, habits of rich people, qualities that rich people have that you don't see in poor people, et cetera, or non-rich people, as opposed to poor or whatever. But knowing what habits or qualities overlap can be useful, but what I would do is not stop there, and I would use those qualities that overlap as clues to the underlying frames, try to use them to figure out what's really going on. Like if someone's decisive, or if it's noticed that people that make a lot of money tend to also be decisive, which means they make decisions quickly and stick with them fairly well and don't change their mind very quickly. Just again, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it does tend to be something that goes along with people that are wealthy. And it is, I would say it's fair to say that it's a personality trait that I have. So I'm at least a one-for-one example of that, which obviously doesn't prove a damn thing, but whatever. So now, Julie, have you heard one of my main cures for a lot of that'll chop off a lot of your indecisiveness? Have you heard me talk about when a lot of decisions that seem difficult? It's because like what college to go to as an example. There's plenty of examples that will apply to you guys now, but I'm just it's easy to see with choosing a college. So with choosing a college, it looks like it has a huge impact because it's like where you'll spend 4 years of your life, right? It'll determine a whole bunch of people you'll be friends with will be all different. If you go to one college or a different college, you'll different all kinds of stuff, right? Different environment, big or small college, what part of the country, all that. But a lot of these decisions, it looks like they have a big impact, but you can't you can't really eyeball the difference between the two of them. So based on what you know, the difference in what you decide is actually going to be very small. So the difference will be very small, and that's why it's hard to see which one to pick. And so ironically, it's an easy decision because you can actually just pick randomly, because whatever you pick, you can't tell the difference anyway, so you might as well just pick one. And when people get frozen about that stuff, they eat up a lot of psychic energy, creativity, time, and so forth, and they kind of don't go to the next step in life. Or like a headline for a sales letter, or what product to take to market. Well, if you can't tell the difference, just pick one, and you'll learn something from picking one. Right? Once you reframe your overall understanding of making progress in life to gaining understanding, which involves distinctions, seeing more frames, more, you can, right, even if you open up WordPress for the first time and poke around, now you can picture a whole bunch of stuff about WordPress that you couldn't before. Even if you couldn't do anything useful that while you were poking around on WordPress for the first hour, or ClickFunnels or whatever, you can picture all kinds of stuff about how the interface is. Even if you can't remember any of the details of what was on the menu, you still can kind of picture the overall layout in a way that you couldn't before, and that's going to speed you up a lot. Or here, when someone tells you how to do it, you'll learn it a lot better. My point being that gaining understanding is pretty easy once you realize how many things, what kind of form it takes, and you just pick something, and no matter what, you're going to make progress in terms of understanding. Part of it is feeling like you're going to have a setback, so that, like a related thing, you'll have a setback if you choose the wrong thing, but you can never have a setback if you have the correct model of the world. Right? A setback is only relative to a fictitious future that doesn't exist. So literally, the future doesn't exist. You literally can't know the future, right? But that's just always true. And you can guess at it by making analogies that that overlap. But of course you can't know it, and it literally has never happened. So you can't have a setback. You can't have the future be worse than it is or anything. It just is what it is, right? Whatever, how things unfold. Let me read what else you wrote then. When it's hard, yeah, it's probably mentioned in Think and Grow Rich. Luca, thanks for pointing that out. Julie says, when it's hard to make a decision, then there's not a clear, better decision that you just pick one. Exactly. That might clear up all of your decisiveness, actually. It might just always be that, right? Again, remember the law of implication. As you try to practice it, you will gain insight. You'll make progress. You'll gain understanding, right? I can talk myself blue in the face, but you'll find that just by trying to apply it, I think you'll just start to gain understanding in a framework and do it better and better. It's extraordinarily powerful, profound, and insightful. Again, it's you focus on what you can know, and you stick there. You keep going from there. Like, you keep on doing more things that you know. So if you can't know what the right decision is, what you can realize is, I don't know what the right decision is. But then you could say, well, if I don't pick one at all, what's going to lead to more understanding? If I sit around not like just repeating myself, the pros and cons over and over in my head, or if I pick one and start to act on it. So you can know that you're either more likely or definitely going to make more progress by picking one at random, basically. And when you pick at random, you'll pick the one that your intuition, feels. And so you might as well. What you're doing when you're using your intuition, you're not like necessarily accessing deep mystical wisdom, right? Your intuition could be wrong, or else the world wouldn't be so screwed up in so many ways, right? There's plenty of great stuff in the world, but then there's plenty of screwed up stuff and decisions and so forth. If people's intuition was as great as they all tell each other it is, right? When they're having dinner together, supporting each other, then they vote better, right? But anyhow, when you go with your intuition, if you have nothing else to go by, that's why I say just eyeball it. Then it's more like you're using like all of the information as best as you can that your mind has access to, subconsciously and consciously, which you might as well do. That doesn't mean deep inner wisdom. It can just mean that, like regarding a person, your mind might have picked up on subconscious cues of dishonesty. Or it could just mean that you've subconsciously found the person handsome and now have bias towards the person being honest. So again, it can fail you. I'm not saying so you want to be very humble about one's intuition, but by using it, you basically access at least, like, to some degree, all the information, subconscious and conscious. But then just pick something. Again, what can you know? You can know that moving forward in some way will do more for you than being paralyzed, and so that's what you know. And act on that, you see. Instead of trying to know something you don't, take advantage of what you do know. It's like being a good servant, or good with the denarii, the talents that you have, right? If you want more talents, then use the ones you have, and you'll find yourself getting more talents, right? If you want more framework, use the framework you have. Same thing in general in life. If you act on what you know. There's all sorts of stuff someone could know in a situation where they're indecisive, such as if they picked one at random and moved forward. Like I said, they make progress. They could know that, and they basically do, in a sense, if they thought about it. So use it. And the more you use what you know, what you actually know, the more you'll be able to differentiate and notice what you know, which will give you access to more known stuff. And then you just get ahead in life on multiple levels just by doing that. It's a very profound idea. I basically earn everything that you're paying me for this series just by the law of implication itself is worth it all. Of course, you're paying me nothing, so it all works out great. Value must have a unit of value, referring to my kind of shared currency, right? We're used to think of that in dollars, right? Yeah, and right, of course, I'm not asserting that we have to use specifically dollars, but in practice, we may as well, right, since other people are doing it. Mike Broadwell says, I just returned from leading a 3-day training course as a pinch hitter when the person who was going to lead it got sick. It was a small group that included some very high-level and leading people in the market, so the alternative health market. But by basically following what I've integrated at this point from LOI, it went really well. Well, thank you. Great testimonial there. The fat path to learning how to successfully use the device I was presenting is gaining the understanding that healing is contextual, not linear. Yeah, and there you go, which is very much related to the idea that there's a number of ingredients or factors or frames, rather than that healing is found within a particular, or that health is found within a particular object, such as your body as a whole, being healthy or not, right? And rather than just found in food or just found in medicine, or but by the same token, a number of the factors that you can get from conventional medicine and also just kind of basic sanitation as well, right, can be helpful, right, and be real factors that affect things. Sometimes you can simply, cut something out, or, put something into place, or, re-sew something, and everything will work out, sometimes you can't. You said, I kept reinforcing that you can't, quote unquote, figure out what people need to heal, but just, oh, beautiful, but just need to remove failure conditions, right? Great. And what I want you guys to get away from is to get away from this idea of looking for a source in a way that's not useful. So sources can be useful in a number of ways. They can overlap with what works in terms of a recipe or a person's advice, right? A person's advice is like a source, right? A person would be a source, and then their advice would be, kind of something coming from that source, however you want to think of it. But you want to think of it in terms of frames causing things, even if we don't have a full understanding even what a frame is, right? But just by starting, having that placeholder and working to fill it in, that's what you want to do, not just by needing closure on what something is too soon. How do I explain this about a source? It's actually really important. I think to a large degree I've kind of explained things that amount to the same thing already, okay, so suppose somebody gives you a Facebook ad or a Facebook ad funnel that works. So first of all, in terms of a couple first of alls there, but I'm thinking out loud here. looking for a Facebook ad funnel that works in the first place is kind of right and wrong at the same time. It's perfectly valid to look for something that works. But ultimately, you want to do everything in the sense of building your framework, your understanding, being able, you can use it practically, like if it's working, first thing I do is just try it as is, right? If it works, then that's great. That can just get me money and accolades from my client and maybe referrals or whatever, right? No problem using something that works and writing it, right, while it's working. But as you're doing that, I do the same thing with accelerated learning, right? I saw things that worked, but then at the same time as letting people know about them, I would use them to dig and try to figure out what was really going on. And also to break outside of my framework. If my framework that I currently had for the mind and learning and everything didn't allow me to, didn't lead me to have figured that thing out myself, or, you know, if the thing didn't kind of fit in with my existing framework, well, then I would also use it to expand and break out of my frame, right, my framework. And I don't really know how to describe that very well. Over time, I'll probably figure out how to describe better and better. But I think that just by trying to understand stuff, that gets you a lot of the way, right? Not just trying to think, well, this funnel works, and then I'm good. And go on to the next thing. If there's an urgent bottleneck, sure, but at some point, understanding conversion or something that works is very helpful to understand conversion. So is something that works and stopped working. So is comparing something that works with something that didn't work, right? If you tried something that didn't work very well, then you got something that did, then you want to try to figure out what it was. And again, once again, when you're doing that, you don't want to just identify objects and assign them as the cause. Like, oh, okay, they have this headline, or they have a big headline, or they have a sub-headline, or they have images and I didn't have images. But then you want to ask, well, why does it matter to have images? And then you might not even find the answer until a year later. You might be reading one of the books I recommend, and they might give you a sense of something that helps you realize what images do and how they can kind of whatever, right? Or certain images, like images might not matter as a whole, but an image of a person smiling can trigger something in people's minds. And that might not be the full answer. That in and of itself is not necessarily like the deepest answer, but it still gives you more of a clue and more of a sense. And then you might ask why that is. And you might come up with an answer right away. It might take you a while, right? But by overall looking at life that way, you're going to be coming up with more questions and then more answers and digging deeper, and you'll be coming up with ingredients. And I think it was pretty powerful in terms of demonstrating the difference between frames and objects when I showed you the ingredients for anger, right? How it consisted of frames and categories and so forth. It's very different than talking about it in terms of things that make you angry or events, whatever. Or just calling it a setback. I didn't just say setbacks make people angry, right? You say, so it's fine to identify objects. When you do, you're identifying something that overlaps with what works, and then that's going to, certainly give you clues to the, what's underlying things. Jennifer says, thank you, David. This is really good food for thought. I'm currently applying this concept of frames to a family situation. My grandfather passed away on Monday, and family members are making choices that I'm looking at in a more respectful, alchemist way than I would have before. What you would have shared this series in early ones. Okay, cool. Right, like if someone attends a funeral or doesn't, or does whatever, they bicker among themselves. You don't want to be like, well, they're doing that because they're a jerk or because they're selfish, right? It isn't that they are or are not being selfish, but if you're getting closure in life, thinking just in terms of objects as causing things and as inherently having these properties, then you're missing out on so much of what's really going on, And so if you do something that would be described as looking below the surface, but then what you're looking for is like attractors. I'm getting a little close to the end of the webinar, but But let me give you this mental picture. Imagine like a sphere, like an Earth, like the Earth or something like that. And on the surface, there are like, whatever, formations or certain types of terrain and so forth. Or you can just imagine a bunch of iron filings on the surface. And then suppose there's a much deeper, underneath that is a bunch of magnets or attractors, or even waves, or whatever you want to think of it, but that are actually causing the surface to be the way that it is. If we kind of transfer that mental picture now to like a what's on a computer screen or like on a video game or something, right? Then there's this kind of like underlying code that causes the pixels to do what they are, however you want to think of it. And then there's an underlying stuff going on in the coder's mind, right? There's like that cause the coder to code the code, and then there might be underlying stuff in the market where they want certain things or demand certain things in games that they want to buy. That is a kind of deeper frame or norm, which is causing the thoughts and the or the norms or the boundaries or restrictions in the programmer's mind, right? And so there's layer after layer of these kind of norms or attractors or gravitational forces or vectors, magnets, however you want to think of them. But the nature of them is they're not objects. They function like waves or magnets or frames, right? All those are kind of representations. I use multiple ones to actually keep you from getting too much of a sense of closure around one representation, right? Calling it a frame is like an object, right, that you can picture. So that's good, right, that you can represent it, but it's bad in the sense that it can give you a kind of overly restrictive view of what I mean. That's why I'm using a number of things like currents, magnets, attractors, norms. None of these are exactly synonyms. They're all imperfect representations or subsets of what I mean, right? So they kind of give you an overall sense of what's going on. As soon as you have a mind involved, or multiple minds, right? And when you're making money, you're really dealing with minds, right? Minds perceive value. They make decisions on whether to buy. Your mind is whether you're motivated to do stuff or whether you're intimidated to do stuff, right? And you have conceptual boxes you need to often break out of or do creative problem solving. So your mind is involved nonstop in making money, and so are other people's minds. As soon as minds are involved, then viewing the world as objects with qualities that cause things is particularly unhelpful, particularly restrictive, and leads you to closure and not really getting a sense of what goes into things, right? In a very practical way, I am both able to not anger other people very much, which is helpful in business, especially you don't want to enrage people, right? Especially not with the internet. For the most part, I don't. And I also, I don't really get angry very much myself in life. If I do, I also am aware of the general types of frames that go together to cause that, and then I just kind of reframe things, and then I can dissolve it. Another thing about looking at things in terms of objects, when people are like angry or when they're grieving or something, if you don't dissolve it, you have to kind of swamp it, which is inefficient and to a good degree ineffective, right? Like if you're kind of angry and don't dissolve it, then you kind of carry that forward, and your day becomes a mixture of being angry about a particular thing and then whatever maybe good things happen, but it kind of colors the other stuff you do, and it doesn't really, it can kind of get swamped out, but it's still there. If you dissolve it, it's not affecting things. If there's a misunderstanding or an issue with you and another person, if you just try to do a bunch of good things to make up for it, that is not that effective, weirdly enough, right? In a number of ways, where like it can be effective in a way, but there's times when people will just notice or remember the bad thing and forget about the good things, or it's hard for people to compare bad stuff you do and good stuff you do in the same basket, so they kind of waffle between both one or the other. If you kind of dissolve the misunderstanding and kind of get rid of it, that can be helpful. When you see the world in terms of frames, you can dissolve things a lot better, and you can also create new spaces, new fresh spaces, so you don't have to have this so much effort to kind of or like if there's a frame that's messing with your motivation for something, if you dissolve it and get it right, so you're naturally motivated, then you don't need to keep on adding factors that get you motivated, like giving yourself cookies or whatever the heck people do. You don't have to wake up day after day and try to do the hard thing first or the easy thing first or whatever. That'll work for a little while, but there's a way that it'll tend to catch up with you, you know. This kind of seeking understanding, dissolving, seeing things in terms of waves or frames and ingredients, but in kind of ingredients in terms of like frame type of ingredients. Cool. Did I say I was going to say something about anything else? I was just saying about the sphere. I've referred to this in some ways before, but if you guys would, or if you individually, as an individual listener, would adopt this kind of in a permanent, integrated way into your worldview, where you see, whenever you notice that you're attributing causation to the surface, right, with this idea of this sphere or this like Earth-like thing, where the terrain or the iron filings is caused, or the configuration of them is caused by things below the surface of it that are of a different nature, like magnets are of a different nature than the iron filings, right? Than the things that you see interacting, or the code for a computer is of a different nature than the pixels, right? Or, you know, I talked about in a video game where you can shoot people with bullets and you say, this bad guy died because I shot him 3 times, right? I did 100 life points of damage to him. That's why he died. That all makes sense. But how would I explain that in terms of underlying causes? Like it's not like in that case you would need to know the code. But you could in one sense not really understand the mechanics of combat in a game and just kind of watch and see how you shoot bullets and they kill a guy, and not really realize that there could be all kinds of mechanics, like as you start firing, the subsequent bullets do more damage. You might never know that unless you start looking for factors like that, or just there's. I want to be careful in how I explain this, because if I explain it in the wrong way, it can kind of get trivialized in your mind, or you might think that people do this kind of normally. Keep in the forefront of your mind how I describe the ingredients for anger. And there's something about what I said there that's totally not commonly understood in people's minds, right? Also, if people were looking for underlying frames, they would all come to the same conclusion of that epistemology, the idea of how we know what's true, or what's the foundational frames that are kind of set that we can build from there back up. All those types of questions would be normal conversation. They'd be normally understood in our normal culture as vitally important, whereas they're completely ignored, right? Questions like that, almost completely ignored. So people aren't doing what I'm saying. If it seems like they are, then you're kind of misunderstanding some of the meaning, some or all of the meaning of what I'm trying to say here. Like sales, you want to think of like, you know, instead of like, oh, what's wrong with me because the person said no, or what am I doing wrong? You want to think in terms of what are the frames, I've indicated many of them, right? Viewing themselves as part of an in-group with you in a way that's relevant, viewing you as the salesperson or the provider of a product or service in terms of certain categories, competence, whatever. Or even if they say yes and send you a check or write you a check, if they categorize you as kind of like an employee versus as like a skilled outsourcer, right, a skilled professional, like more like along the lines of a lawyer or an accountant or whoever, where they would treat them with more like kind of with respect, that would be more ideal for you, right? Thinking in terms of those categories, right? It's easy to think, oh, well, this person is disrespectful to me, instead of thinking, well, maybe they're categorizing me in a way that's leading them to be disrespectful, or relatively disrespectful compared to they categorize me differently. Now, of course, for you and I, we'd rather categorize everyone in a way that we're respectful, right? We don't treat anyone in kind of a disrespectful way. But for other people, they might treat some people kind of respectfully and other people disrespectfully. You might as well pay attention and try to be categorized in the way that they treat respectfully. But if you assign the cause as like they're a person, like an object who's disrespectful, then you won't look for what I talked about with the category and how to come across that way. Right? There's, with a number of people, there's kind of clues they pick up on, maybe with everyone, that have to do with kind of deep-seated evolutionary scientists who are incorrect about Darwinism, but they would, call it like evolutionary traits or whatever, but it has to do with like, or they would say it evolved, but it doesn't have to have evolved. But the idea of like who people view as like kind of an alpha person, male or female, there's certain kind of subliminal, like kind of like things or little ways that you talk or tones or where you look, where your eye level is, how long you spend making eye contact, that will cause people to subconsciously categorize you in different ways, right? And no one of these things is going to be the key or the secret necessarily, right? You don't need to get them all right? Remember about removing failure conditions until you win, right? I happen to not know about that or pay attention to giving off alpha signals or not giving off alpha signals or whatever the heck. I just don't know much about it and I ignore it, and I do fine in life. However, maybe I naturally do fine with that. Maybe I just kind of come off okay. Like, I don't think I come off as particularly alpha necessarily, but which sometimes that can be a drawback anyway, coming off. You don't necessarily want to do that anyway at the right time. If you do it at the wrong time, then it can hurt you. But it's not one of the places that I look in life, but it can be relevant, the place to look, one of the factors. If I was doing more direct kind of networking, then I'd probably pay more attention to it, for example. I more let Mike do that kind of thing, so I don't pay attention to it. Or if he was having problems, which he doesn't, then I might, look into that for him. Megan, about framing money keeping. Something I'd like to learn from you in framing in details is how to gain wealth faster through keeping spending down and how to keep and use money once you have it. And that's a good potential question to ask. To what extent do you live frugally? In the process of making decisions regarding importance or non-importance for spending, time frames for money getting, preserving, spending. One thing is that when you spend less money, then your relationship partner tends to spend less. If you spend more, it tends to give them permission to spend more, right? So it's kind of a double whammy in either direction. One kind of random thought is that I found places that would have kind of a high impact where I wouldn't have to count money at all. Like I might have mentioned this before, but I actually don't watch my spending really regarding like food, right? Because it's the kind of thing that can't really get out of hand, especially practically for me. With some people it could if they order like wine and go to expensive meals all the time. But for me, naturally an expensive meal, I don't mean an expensive meal even in my head, but just naturally could be like $40 or something like that. So even if we went to a nice restaurant that we both liked, sit down, at night it'd be 40 or less, or maybe 46 or so, whatever. But in that range, so it's never going to get out of hand relative to my income. Or like buying Legos for chance, right? For some people that can get out of hand. For some people buying, yachts or cars would not get out of hand. For me, it would if I did that. So that's not one of the things that I could do. But Legos, which can be moderately expensive, right? But I might be 20, 40, 50, $100 a pop, for a box, and I might get one every week or two, for a chance. Or he goes and picks it out and he likes it and he likes to do it. But I don't really worry about that, right? I thought about it, I realized it, wouldn't get out of hand, right? What is it going to be? A few thousand a year max, right? So that's fine for me. But I'm giving you a sense of how I think. None of this is about talking about myself or my financial position, but just kind of giving you a sense. Back when, let's see, I remember early on when I was making OMG, it was about maybe 9 months into it, and it was taking off decently, right? I was probably in the 20, 30, 40,000 range with income, which I kept in mind wouldn't necessarily continue right at that time. But I looked for a house here in Tennessee, right, to keep, and then I got one for under $200,000 because that's what I could pay cash for. I didn't want to go back to getting a mortgage at that time. So I didn't get something out of my price range, although I theoretically could have gotten a loan and gotten a $500,000 house at that point, perhaps. I already owned I owned a $250,000 house outright in Virginia at that point, which I later sold, of course. Eventually, and then we had one car, a Honda Civic at that point, and at some point another car was going to be more useful than the expense. Sorry, I know I haven't really given exact things, really. So I'm kind of giving you the out loud process of thinking about it. I get a lot of entertainment out of video games that are relatively inexpensive, like computer games. So that can't really get out of hand, and so I don't really. My wife really likes to travel sometimes, or really like to visit her family in Russia, so I didn't make that an issue, but that would be a couple thousand. So I kind of keep things proportional. One of the things is, once it was all in sight, I would think about like monthly for the rest of my life and try to live at a rate. Like even if I say had $1 million, then that's what, 50,000 a month for a year for 20 years, and then it's gone. Of course, you can theoretically make some money on it, but then there's also inflation, right? So even in ideal circumstance, it's about going to be a wash, let's say. So I would think that way. You could think in terms of 5 years, and then extend it to where you have things set up for your life. But I don't know, representing it that way kind of helped. But yeah, I don't know how useful that was, but at least it starts to give some ways that I think about things. But that's how I do things, and I just keep going like that until I kind of get some insights out of it, and so forth. I spent hours and hours and hours working on these webinars, believe it or not. And it's kind of a lot like what I just did there. It takes a while, The greatest motivators will come from, Anorexian says, the greatest motivators will come from finding the frames that make taking action natural for you. I think that is pretty much correct. Shema said, I was re-listening to Alchemy Goalscape, specifically about the sub-goals leading to lack of motivation because, right, about like needing feedback. One of the ways that I think about things regarding goals that might be helpful for you guys is I ask this question. It's pretty helpful. Like, I ask what would the kind of ideal way to represent a goal that I wanted kind of result in, and what I mean is kind of ideally how you kind of represented or thought of a goal that you had would involve. It wouldn't involve things that inherently could frustrate you, right? It shouldn't. The ideal way to represent a goal would there wouldn't be a way to have a setback within how you did it, right? Anything would be kind of, in essence, like progress, right? Anything kind of related to doing it, or at least not a setback, right? Or at least not a setback in a negative way. And I've described kind of specifically how I do it, but I'm giving you kind of a sense of what, first I thought well, what is it? What would it look like if I represented goals most helpfully? Another thing I noticed is that with, you could easily imagine there could be a goal that you would achieve, but without seeing there might be a number of steps you might have to take or actions you might have to take where you wouldn't see a result, right? Akin to opening a combination lock, where the lock doesn't open at all until you do a number of combinations, right? And there's a lot of stuff like that in life, right? Or where you need to develop a framework before you're going to learn details. People that want to see details being learned well when they're learning, they get themselves in a vicious cycle where they don't have a framework. They need to see a result that they don't have the framework for. And that also blocks them from wanting to get a framework, so they feel frustrated, do the wrong stuff. Same thing with people needing to make money right away when they're trying to overall make money. You might need to build various things up in order to make money first. And so if you need to see money being made each step of the way, that's going to lock you out of any path that you'd have to traverse for a while before you saw money coming in, right? So you'd want your overall way of representing goals to allow you to act in what we'd probably call faith, right? Where you could walk not with seeing results, but somehow know that you're making progress if you are, right? You want to be able to make progress, so have some way know that you are, or guess that you are, act as if you know that you are, and keep going, right? Anyway, so that gives a start of just kind of getting a few kind of thoughts sparked by some of these things. I'm a little bit getting to the end of my useful brain thinking here. Mike said, as part of working on my health program, a powerful bridge or analogy or frame to open people up to law of implication and looking at how their thinking is off base came to me. It revealed itself as I went through the process and has worked pretty well in my limited testing. It's the idea of mind sugar, in quotes, something analogous to what sugar does to our bodies, which health-conscious people are well aware of. So it gives them a foothold in a beginning framework to look at how their thinking might be off. Right, something that like looks like it's good, but it actually is and it might even be good in a certain way, but it can quickly get to the point where it's unhelpful in a number of ways, right? Like sugar in our bodies. And I agree, there's a good analogy of that with our mind and thoughts and thinking. And also how people want closure, right? Closure is actually very detrimental to our problem solving, our thinking, our planning. Like when you think you got something before you do. You think you're good at conversion before you are, or just because you have an ad that's working, or you've been successful with something. Or you think you're smart overall when in fact you have some good frameworks for things, but you don't just want to think that you're smart overall, because then when you don't have a framework, you either fall on your face when you don't want to and you didn't see it coming, or you are unwilling to put the time in to learn, and and so forth. So closure, and it's tough. Part of the thing that I'm aware of with teaching is that, especially when I have to teach topics where closure is particularly not going to be what we're going to usefully get, right? There's certain topics where people have enough of a framework where you can just teach them in a way where people kind of get closure every step of the way. So it analogous to if you can give someone a money-making method where they could see results overnight and they were traveling in the right direction. They were doing stuff that was useful for long-term good results. In a way, SEO has part of that because they can start to see how they can rank a site. It kind of all, like it's all pretty accessible to people. With the stuff that I teach, I don't know, right? Like, and it depends on the people I'm talking to, right? Like a lot of you guys realistically are pretty great with it, right? Where you feel a sense of progress from us talking, whereas a number of other people listening to the same webinar wouldn't feel a sense of progress. They'd be like, I wish David would get to the point, or, or I'm not, that, whatever it might be. But there's a way that it doesn't lend itself necessarily to closure. Although I'd probably in a lot of webinars, you guys probably even more than I think get a sense like you made progress and so forth, which is good. So good, nice analogy, Mike. I might end things around here. Let me take a look at what Lauren says though. It says, I'm having a hard time making progress with this stuff outside of your webinars. Things tend to make sense while I'm listening to you explain them, but it turns into a mess in my head outside of that. If I'm understanding you right, this is normal and all part of the process, or am I messing up somewhere? It is normal, and certainly you want to keep watching the webinars for sure. So you're definitely making progress if you're on the webinars. That's not wrong. Trying to think if there's anything you can do. Maybe one of the things I will try to think and work on and ideally have ready for next time, but I can't promise it, is some indications of what you can do outside of our webinars that are kind of something that's a specific either action step or kind of a pseudo action step, something you're at least looking for that week in your, conceptually or something. I'm betting you're making more progress than you might realize. And a lot of people, I think Julie was saying this the other webinar, but it's also normal for people to spend a few months or even years where they are not sure that they're making progress. They feel like they like my webinars. They feel like it's making sense. And then something clicks over time. So that's probably going to happen with you regardless. It's also highly recommended to find the time to rewatch webinars. I know we only have a certain amount of time in life, but this is very impactful stuff that you're going to be so much better off by kind of getting it and integrating it into your life. It's not like a kind of really a pet thing of mine, like a pet topic, all this stuff about the mind. It's really genuinely very impactful, and that's why I'm interested in it. And it's genuinely really critical for money making, like of course you can make money without ever hearing of me. Obviously zillions of people have done that or thinking about these topics, but there's a way that the symptoms or the problems of this is going to show up in kind of all kinds of places in someone's life, in essence. You're going to kind of get lucky in certain areas where basically like perseverance, you're going to feel naturally like kind of motivated, plus you might kind of really apply yourself and persevere with some willpower and succeed in certain areas in life. But there's a kind of all-encompassing success and even like, kind of happiness and peace of mind that's going to only come from addressing these topics. And there's kind of no route to them overall, or that kind of overall success in life without addressing what we're talking about. And a number of the things I'm talking about are not opinion either. They're kind of necessary truths that are going to kind of mess with you. Like this overall thing about assigning causality to objects. It's going to lead you wrong predictably in life plenty. It's going to work plenty, and then it's going to screw you up plenty. And there's no getting around that, right? No one's going to avoid being screwed by it a lot or screwing other people because of messing with it. So one way I can think about things that you can do outside that are more specific about. And then no matter what, I think that things will start to click and coalesce more as you rewatch or as you just stick with me with new webinars. Oh, don't worry, your Webleys are part of my weekly regimen. That's awesome. Excellent. As long as you're sticking with me, I think we're in great shape. Very true. That's a good analogy. I'll end with it. Like in Magic, Lucas says, the card game that I played, a card isn't good or bad on its own, but works or doesn't work in certain decks or meta games. Exactly. In the overall environment of the other cards that are printed. Excellent. Yeah, if people all played Magic, I can give a lot more examples a lot quicker. Part of my problem is we don't have that to talk about or other games to talk about. Okay, guys, terrific. Good progress, I think. And we will continue next week. I'm always looking to kind of get to where I'm specifically talking about accelerated learning, although I really gave some good insight this time on the learning. Although what a great picture of Chance. That's my son with the books that Mike sent him that I referred to earlier. Anyhow, and you guys, anyone might enjoy Lloyd Alexander's series. Starts with the Book of Three, right? Chronicles of Prydain, I think it is. But I'm enjoying it at the age of 44, I think I am. Something like close to 18 is all I can remember about how old I am. But anyhow, great stuff. So I will talk to you guys next week, and I'll give some more sense of accelerated learning. I'm not trying to drip it out. I'm just trying to create the overall context for you to really, if you understand the mind, then you will, it's a subset of that, understand learning. And I'll talk about it specifically. But there's a way that you'll get so much more at it. Like really accelerated learning is about understanding how learning takes place rather than just a bunch of like what amount to objects or techniques that sound good, but they're really not that helpful in practice. Like I can give you a bunch of this, that, and the other thing, but really, just like with health, with lots of, with anything, understanding it overall is what's going to do it for you, not just, be given a bunch of kind of candy. All right, guys, I will talk to you next week. You're very welcome, Brian and Susanna and Leah. And Julie, thank you for saying another great session. You're welcome. And here, Mike put the Chronicles of Prydain on here. Did I see persuasion? See it where, Faith? Is it's a book by Cialdini, right? Do you mean, do I see it as existing as a book, or well, I haven't read it or seen it, and I'm aware of it existing, but that's about it. His stuff is certainly useful for kind of like Think and Grow Rich, where if you kind of think about it, then you'll come up with things that are helpful. Using it too much with closure will kind of keep you kind of on the surface, generally. But I'm sure it'll be useful for people. Yeah, I just got it. Wondering if you read it. No, I haven't read it yet, but I can check it out for sure. You're very welcome, Monica. Thank you for saying very enlightening. Glad you felt it so. Glad to have you on the webinar. Okay, guys, have a terrific week, and I'll see you all next week.